The church has been lying to you for over 1400 years. What I'm about to show you will shake the very foundation of everything you thought you knew about Christianity, about the Bible, and about one of history's most misunderstood figures. Because buried beneath centuries of deliberate deception lies a truth so explosive that it threatened to topple the entire structure of organized religion. A truth about a just woman who wasn't a follower of Jesus, but his chosen successor. A woman whose authority was so profound that it sparked a power struggle that would define Christianity for millennia. Her name is Mary Magdalene, and she was never a prostitute. That's right. The woman history remembers as a reformed harlot, the penitent sinner weeping at Jesus' feet, never sold her body for money. Not once does the Bible explicitly call her a prostitute. Not in Matthew, not in Mark, not in Luke, not in John. This label, this devastating smear campaign that has defined her for over 1,000 years, was manufactured, deliberately, systematically, by men who feared what she represented. The lie was officially cemented on September 3rd, 591 CE, when Pope Gregory I stood before his congregation and declared that Mary Magdalene, Mary of Bethany, and the unnamed sinful woman who washed Jesus' feet were all the same person. With those words, he transformed the most powerful woman in early Christianity into a cautionary tale about female sexuality. But why would the Pope create such a blatant falsehood? What was he trying to hide? The answer lies buried in the sands of Egypt, in texts that were banned, burned, and forgotten for over 1,500 years. Texts that reveal a completely different story about Mary Magdalene. Texts that show she wasn't just one of Jesus' followers. She was his spiritual equal, his chosen heir, the keeper of his most sacred secrets. And the early church fathers knew it. Today, we're going down the rabbit hole that the Vatican never wanted you to explore. We're going to examine the forbidden Gospels, the secret texts that paint a radically different picture of early Christianity. We're going to uncover the real Mary Magdalene, strip away the lies, and reveal why her true story had to be buried. Because what you're about to discover doesn't just change everything about Mary Magdalene. It changes everything about Christianity before itself. But forbidden texts, into these we dive just how systematic need to understand this cover-up was. The prostitute narrative wasn't an accident or a misunderstanding. It was a weapon. A character assassination so thorough that it lasted for 14 centuries. Even today, mention Mary Magdalene and most people immediately think of a reformed sex worker, not a spiritual leader. That's the power of propaganda, and the early church wielded it like a sword. Here's what actually happened. In the canonical Gospels, Mary Magdalene appears as one of Jesus' most devoted followers. She's present at the crucifixion when most of the male disciples had fled. She's at the tomb on Easter morning. She's the first person to witness the resurrection. In fact, all 4 canonical Gospels agree on this point, which is remarkable given their differences on almost everything else. She was so important that she earned the title Apostle to the Apostles, because she was the one who brought news of the resurrection to the other disciples. But somewhere between the 1st century and the 6th century, her story began to change. The powerful woman who stood at the foot of the cross became confused with other women mentioned in the Gospels. Her identity became blurred, then deliberately obscured. And finally, Pope Gregory delivered the killing blow, officially branding her a prostitute and ensuring that no one would ever take her seriously as a religious authority again. The timing of this character assassination is crucial. By the 6th century, the Roman Catholic Church was establishing itself as the supreme religious authority in the Western world. They were codifying doctrine, establishing hierarchy, and most importantly, ensuring that all religious power flowed through male clerical lines. A woman who claimed apostolic authority, who had been personally chosen by Jesus to receive special revelations, was a direct threat to this emerging system. She had to be neutralized. And neutralized she was, so effectively that her for over a millennium true story was lost. Until 1945, when a group of Egyptian farmers made one of the most significant archaeological discoveries in human history. They found 13 leather-bound papyrus books buried in a sealed jar near the town of Nag Hammadi. Inside these ancient codices were 52 texts that had been banned by the early church and presumed lost forever. These were the Gnostic Gospels, and they told a completely different story about early Christianity. Among these forbidden texts were several that mentioned Mary Magdalene prominently, not as a repentant sinner, but as Jesus' spiritual equal and chosen successor. The Gospel of Mary Magdalene, the Gospel of Philip, the Gospel of Thomas, and Pistis Sophia all painted a picture of a woman who possessed secret knowledge that even the male apostles lacked. A woman who was, in every sense that mattered, Jesus' true heir. But here's where the story gets really interesting. These texts didn't just reveal Mary Magdalene's elevated status. They also revealed the conflict this caused among Jesus' followers. They showed that there was a power struggle in early Christianity, a battle between those who accepted Mary's authority and those who rejected it. And leading the opposition was none other than Simon Peter, the man who would become the foundation of the Roman Catholic Church. The Gospel of Mary Magdalene is particularly revealing in this regard. In this text, Mary shares special revelations that Jesus had given to her privately. But when she tries to share this knowledge with the other disciples, Peter becomes enraged. He can't accept that Jesus would have revealed important teachings to a woman. He argues that her stature cannot be greater than that of the male apostles. The text explicitly describes the tension between Mary and Peter, showing that this wasn't just a theological disagreement, but a fundamental conflict over who had the right to lead the early Christian movement. This same pattern appears in multiple Gnostic texts. In the Gospel of Thomas, Peter demands that Mary be sent away because females are not worthy of life. In Pistis Sophia, Peter complains that Mary talks too much and doesn't let the men speak. And Mary herself responds, saying she's afraid of Peter because he threatens me and hates our gender. These aren't isolated incidents. They represent a systematic pattern of male apostles, led by Peter, attempting to diminish Mary's authority and exclude women from positions of religious leadership. The numbers in Pistis Sophia are particularly striking. Of the 64 questions posed to Jesus in this text, 39 come from Mary Magdalene. She initiates discourse or gives teachings 83 times, while all the other disciples combined do so only 48 times. In other words, Mary dominates the conversation almost 2-to-1. She's not just participating in these discussions, she's leading them. She's the primary interpreter of Jesus' teachings, the one the others turn to for understanding. But perhaps the most explosive revelation comes from the Gospel of Philip. This text doesn't just call Mary a disciple or a follower. It calls her Jesus' companion, using the Greek word koinonos, which implies a partnership of equals. The text states that Jesus loved her more than all the other disciples and that he used to kiss her frequently. Now, before you jump to conclusions about the nature of this relationship, it's important to understand that in Gnostic tradition, kissing was often a metaphor for sharing spiritual knowledge. The text is saying that Jesus shared his deepest spiritual insights with Mary more than with anyone else. The Gospel of Philip goes even further, describing Mary as one of 3 women who always walked with the Lord. But unlike Jesus' mother and her sister, who are defined by their relationship to men, Mary is defined by her own spiritual status. She's his companion, his equal, his partner in revealing divine truth to the world. This is the Mary Magdalene that the early church fathers were so desperate to hide. Not a reformed prostitute grateful for Jesus' forgiveness, but a powerful spiritual teacher who claimed direct authority from Jesus himself. A woman who threatened the emerging patriarchal structure of organized Christianity. A woman who had to be destroyed before she could challenge the male monopoly on religious power. The suppression of these texts wasn't accidental. When St. Athanasius issued his festal letter in 367 CE, condemning the use of non-canonical books, communities that possessed these texts were forced to hide or destroy them. Many scholars believe that the Nag Hammadi Library was buried by monks from a nearby monastery who were trying to preserve these texts from destruction. They literally buried the truth to keep it from being lost forever, but the damage had already been done. By the 4th century, the version of Christianity promoted by Peter and his successors had won. The Roman Emperor Constantine had made Christianity the official religion of the empire. But it was a specific kind of Christianity, one with a clear hierarchy, with male bishops and priests, with no room for female apostolic authority. The Gnostic Christians, with their emphasis on direct spiritual experience and their acceptance of female teachers, were branded as heretics. Their books were banned, their communities disbanded, their leaders persecuted. And at the center of this theological purge was the deliberate destruction of Mary Magdalene's reputation. She couldn't just be ignored or forgotten. She was too prominent in the canonical Gospels for that. Instead, she had to be reimagined, transformed from a threat into a symbol of female subservience. The prostitute narrative served this purpose perfectly. It acknowledged her importance while simultaneously explaining why she could never be taken seriously as a religious authority. Think about the psychological impact of this transformation. Every time someone heard Mary Magdalene's name, they would think not of apostolic authority, but of sexual sin. Not of spiritual wisdom, but of moral failure. Not of divine revelation, but of human weakness. It was character assassination on a scale that would make modern political operatives envious. But the forbidden Gospels reveal something else, something even more threatening to established religious authority. They show that the conflict between Mary and Peter wasn't just about gender. It was about two fundamentally different approaches to Christianity. Peter represented what would become Orthodox Christianity, with its emphasis on institutional authority, hierarchical structure, and standardized doctrine. Mary represented Gnostic Christianity, with its emphasis on direct spiritual experience, personal revelation, and the equality of all believers, regardless of gender. In the Gnostic view, salvation didn't come through the church or through priests. It came through gnosis, through direct knowledge of the divine. And who better to guide others to this knowledge than someone who had received the most intimate spiritual instruction from Jesus himself? Mary Magdalene wasn't just a teacher in the Gnostic tradition. She was the teacher, the one who possessed the secret knowledge that could unlock the mysteries of existence. This is why her story had to be suppressed. It wasn't enough to simply exclude women from positions of authority. The very idea that someone could claim spiritual authority outside of established institutional channels was too dangerous to tolerate. Mary Magdalene represented the possibility that ordinary people, including women, could have direct access to divine truth without going through official religious channels. She embodied a form of Christianity that was fundamentally democratic, fundamentally egalitarian, and fundamentally threatening to those who sought to control religious authority. The victory of Peter's vision over Mary's wasn't just a victory of orthodoxy over heresy. It was the victory of institutional control over spiritual freedom, of hierarchical authority over democratic access to the divine, of male supremacy over gender equality. And it set the pattern for Christianity that would persist for the next 2,000 years. But the forbidden Gospels survived, buried in the Egyptian desert, waiting to be rediscovered. And when they finally came to light in 1945, they revealed the magnitude of what had been lost. They showed us a Mary Magdalene, who was not just Jesus' follower, but his spiritual equal. A woman who possessed secret knowledge that made her the rightful leader of the early Christian movement. A teacher whose authority was so profound that it took centuries of systematic suppression to obscure her true role in Christian history. The question we must ask ourselves is this: what would Christianity look like today if Mary Magdalene's version had won instead of Peter's? What would a Christianity led by Mary Magdalene have looked like? The forbidden texts give us tantalizing glimpses of this alternate reality, and it's radically different from anything we recognize today. Instead of massive cathedrals and golden altars, we might have seen intimate gatherings where spiritual knowledge was shared freely among equals. Instead of a rigid hierarchy of priests and bishops, we might have seen communities where women and men both served as teachers and guides. Instead of salvation through institutional sacraments, we might have seen salvation through direct personal experience of the divine. The Gnostic Christians who followed Mary's teachings believed that every human being carried a spark of the divine within them. They didn't need priests to intercede with God because they could connect with the divine directly. They didn't need elaborate rituals because they believed that true worship happened in the depths of the soul. And most revolutionary of all, they didn't believe that gender determined your spiritual capacity. In Mary's Christianity, women and men were equally capable of receiving divine revelation, equally qualified to teach and lead, equally deserving of spiritual authority. But this vision was systematically destroyed, and the evidence of its destruction is written in blood across the pages of history. The Gnostic Christians weren't just defeat debates theologicaled in. They were hunted down, tortured, and killed. Their books were burned in public squares. Their communities were disbanded by force. Their leaders were executed as heretics. By the 5th century, Gnostic Christianity had been almost entirely erased from the historical record. Almost, but not entirely. Because those 13 leather-bound books buried in the Egyptian desert contained something that the Church Fathers thought they had destroyed forever: the actual words of the Gnostic Christians themselves. And when scholars finally translated these texts in the decades following their discovery, they revealed not just a different Mary Magdalene, but a completely different understanding of what Christianity was supposed to be. The Gospel of Mary Magdalene, for instance, doesn't focus on Jesus' death and resurrection the way the canonical Gospels do. Instead, it focuses on his teachings about the nature of reality, the path to spiritual enlightenment, and the role of divine wisdom in human life. In this text, Mary isn't mourning at the cross or weeping at the tomb. She's teaching the other disciples about the spiritual visions Jesus had shared with her, explaining complex theological concepts that they struggle to understand. When Peter challenges her authority in this text, it's not just about gender. It's about two fundamentally different approaches to spiritual truth. Peter wants concrete answers, clear rules, established authority. Mary offers something far more challenging: the invitation to seek truth through personal spiritual experience, to question everything, to find the divine spark within yourself rather than submitting to external religious authority. The dialogue between them is electric with tension. Peter demands to know why Jesus would reveal secrets to Mary that he didn't share with the men. Levi, another disciple, defends Mary, saying, "If the Saviour made her worthy, who are you to reject her?" But the damage is done. The seeds of conflict have been planted, and we know from history which side ultimately won. In Pistis Sophia, the tension escalates even further. This massive text, containing over 400 pages in translation, presents Mary Magdalene as the dominant voice in post-resurrection discussions with Jesus. She asks the most insightful questions, provides the most sophisticated interpretations, demonstrates the deepest understanding of spiritual mysteries. At one point, Jesus himself acknowledges her superiority, saying, "Mary, you blessed one, whom I will complete in all mysteries of those of the height. Speak openly, you whose heart is directed to the kingdom of heaven more than all your brothers." But Peter grows increasingly frustrated with Mary's prominence. He complains that she dominates every conversation, that she doesn't let the men speak, that she acts as if she's more important than the original 12 apostles. Mary's response is heartbreaking in its honesty. "My master, I understand in my mind that I can come forward at any time to interpret what Pistis Sophia has said, but I am afraid of Peter because he threatens me and hates our gender." Think about what this reveals. Here is a woman who has been personally chosen by Jesus to receive his most advanced spiritual teachings, who demonstrates superior understanding of divine mysteries, who is acknowledged by Jesus himself as spiritually advanced beyond all the other disciples. And yet she's afraid to speak because of male hostility and gender-based hatred. This isn't ancient history. This is a pattern that has been repeated countless times throughout the subsequent 2,000 years of Christian history. The Gospel of Thomas adds another layer to this conflict. In this text, which many scholars believe contains some of the earliest recorded sayings of Jesus, we see the battle lines drawn even more clearly. When Peter declares that Mary should leave us, for females are not worthy of life, Jesus responds with a statement that has puzzled scholars for decades. "I will guide her to make her male, so that she too may become a living spirit resembling you males." On the surface, this seems to support Peter's position that women are spiritually inferior. But Gnostic theology was far more sophisticated than that. In the Gnostic understanding, male and female weren't just biological categories, they were spiritual states. Male represented active spiritual power, the capacity to receive and transmit divine knowledge. Female represented receptive spiritual wisdom, the ability to understand and interpret divine truth. The goal wasn't to make women literally male, but to help them transcend gender limitations entirely and claim their full spiritual authority. This is why the Gospel of Philip can describe Mary as Jesus' koinonos, his spiritual partner and equal. The text states explicitly that there were 3 women who always walked with Jesus: Mary his mother, her sister, and Mary Magdalene, who was called his companion. But notice the distinction. The other 2 women are defined by their relationship to men: Mary the mother, the sister. Only Mary Magdalene is defined by her own spiritual status as Jesus' companion, his partner in revealing divine truth. The most controversial passage in the Gospel of Philip has been endlessly debated by scholars. The text says that Jesus loved Mary more than all the other disciples and used to kiss her frequently. The word for kiss appears in a damaged section of the manuscript, leading to speculation about what exactly Jesus was doing. But the context makes it clear that this is about spiritual intimacy, not physical romance. In Gnostic tradition, the kiss was a symbol of spiritual transmission, the passing of divine knowledge from teacher to student. What the text is really saying is that Jesus shared his deepest spiritual insights with Mary more frequently and more intimately than with anyone else. She was his primary student, his chosen successor, the one who best understood his teachings and was most qualified to carry them forward. This wasn't about sexual attraction. It was about spiritual recognition. Jesus recognized in Mary a capacity for divine understanding that exceeded even that of his male disciples. This interpretation is supported by the way these texts describe Mary's actual spiritual abilities. In the Gospel of Mary, she doesn't just receive visions from Jesus. She explains them to the other disciples when they're confused and frightened. When the disciples are paralyzed by fear after Jesus' death, Mary comforts them and gives them strength to continue their mission. She demonstrates exactly the kind of spiritual leadership that the early church desperately needed. But here's the crucial point. Mary's authority in these texts doesn't come from Jesus' romantic favor or special affection. It comes from her spiritual capacity, her ability to understand and transmit divine truth. She earns her position through merit, through demonstrated wisdom, through actual spiritual accomplishment. This makes the later church's prostitute narrative even more insidious. It suggests that the only way a woman could have been close to Jesus was through sexual availability, completely erasing the possibility that she might have earned her position through spiritual excellence. The systematic nature of this erasure becomes clear when you look at how other early Christian texts handled Mary's prominence. The Acts of Philip, for instance, originally included Mary Magdalene as a major character, traveling with Philip and serving as an evangelist in her own right. But later versions of the text edited her out almost entirely, replacing her with male disciples or simply deleting scenes where she appeared as a leader. Similarly, early Christian art from the catacombs often depicted Mary Magdalene in positions of authority, teaching, blessing, even performing what appear to be priestly functions. But as church doctrine became more restrictive toward women, these images were either destroyed or reinterpreted. A fresco showing Mary teaching became a scene of her repenting. A mosaic of her blessing followers was explained as her receiving forgiveness. The documentary evidence for this systematic suppression is overwhelming. Church fathers like Jerome and Augustine wrote extensively about the need to control and limit women's participation in religious life. They argued that women were naturally inferior, more susceptible to temptation, incapable of the rational thought necessary for theological leadership. They used selective biblical quotations to support these positions, ignoring or reinterpreting passages that suggested female spiritual authority. But perhaps most tellingly, they consistently attacked the Gnostic texts that presented Mary Magdalene as a spiritual leader. Irenaeus, writing in the 2nd century, specifically condemned the Gnostics for allowing women to teach and prophesy. Tertullian mocked Gnostic communities for permitting women to baptize and perform other priestly functions. Epiphanius accused the Gnostics of being led astray by women who claimed to receive divine revelations. Notice the pattern. It wasn't enough to simply exclude women from leadership positions in Orthodox Christianity. The Church Fathers felt compelled to attack and discredit any Christian community that did accept female spiritual authority. They understood instinctively that Mary Magdalene's example was dangerous to their vision of male-only religious hierarchy. If people believed that Jesus had chosen a woman as his primary successor, it would undermine the entire structure they were trying to build. The stakes of this conflict couldn't have been higher. By the 4th century, Christianity was becoming the official religion of the Roman Empire. Enormous political and economic power was at stake. Whoever controlled Christian doctrine would control the spiritual lives of millions of people and the material resources of the church. The version of Christianity that emerged victorious would shape Western civilization for the next 2 millennia. In this context, Mary Magdalene represented more than just an inconvenient woman who needed to be silenced. She represented an entire alternative vision of what Christianity could be. More democratic, more egalitarian, more open to direct spiritual experience, less dependent on institutional authority. She was the living symbol of everything that the emerging Orthodox Church was determined to suppress. The tragedy is that this suppression was so successful that for over 1,500 years, almost no one even knew that this alternative vision had existed. The Mary Magdalene that survived in Christian consciousness was the repentant prostitute, grateful for male forgiveness and content to serve in subordinate roles. The Mary Magdalene who challenged apostolic authority, who claimed divine revelation, who taught complex theology to male disciples, was completely forgotten. It took the discovery of the Nag Hammadi Library to begin recovering this lost history. And even now, more than 70 years after those texts were found, most Christians remain unaware of their contents. The prostitute narrative has proved remarkably durable, surviving even clear scholarly evidence that it was fabricated. That's the power of centuries of repetition, of institutional authority, of stories that serve the interests of those in power. But the truth has a way of surfacing, no matter how deeply it's buried. And the truth about Mary Magdalene is finally beginning to reach a broader audience, not just through scholarly books read by academics, but through popular culture, through documentaries, through conversations like this one. The question is, what will we do with this knowledge now that we have it? The implications of what we've uncovered go far beyond ancient history. When the Church Fathers succeeded in burying Mary Magdalene's true story, they didn't just silence one woman. They established a template for how female spiritual authority would be handled for the next 2,000 years. They created a system where any woman who claimed direct revelation, divine who challenged male religious authority, who dared to teach or lead, could be dismissed using the same tactics that destroyed Mary's reputation. Look at the pattern throughout Christian history. Joan of Arc claimed divine visions and led armies in God's name. The church burned her as a witch. Marguerite Porete wrote about direct spiritual experience and the soul's union with God. They burned her too. The Beguines created communities of religious women who lived independently and claimed spiritual authority without male supervision. The church systematically disbanded them and accused them of heresy. Even in modern times, this pattern persists. Women who challenge traditional religious roles are labeled as threats to Christian values, as feminists who want to destroy the biblical order, as dangerous influencers who seek to corrupt sacred tradition. The same character assassination techniques that worked against Mary Magdalene are still being used today, just with updated vocabulary. But here's what makes the Mary Magdalene cover Theop so particularly insidious. Church didn't just silence her voice in the Gnostic texts. They corrupted her image in the very texts they did preserve. In the canonical Gospels, Mary Magdalene appears as Jesus' most faithful follower, the first witness to the resurrection, the one who brings news of the risen Christ to the cowering male disciples. She should be remembered as the hero of the Easter story. Instead, centuries of sermons, art, and popular culture have reduced her to a weeping sinner, grateful for male forgiveness. Think about how this has shaped our understanding of women's spiritual capacity. For 15 centuries, Christian women have been taught that the highest spiritual achievement available to them is repentance from sexual sin. They've been told that their natural state is moral failure, that their bodies are sources of temptation, that their voices cannot be trusted with divine truth. The Mary Magdalene narrative became the template for how Christianity would view women, either as sinful temptresses who needed to be controlled, or as repentant sinners grateful for male spiritual guidance. This isn't just about ancient theology. This is about power, money, and control on a massive scale. The Roman Catholic Church became one of the wealthiest and most powerful institutions in human history, precisely because it established a monopoly on spiritual authority. By claiming that salvation could only come through their sacraments, administered by their priests, overseen by their bishops, they created a system where every spiritual need had to be met through official channels. Mary Magdalene's version of Christianity would have shattered this monopoly. If people believed they could receive direct divine revelation, if they accepted that women could serve as spiritual teachers and leaders, if they embraced the Gnostic idea that everyone carried a divine spark within them, there would be no need for the elaborate hierarchical structure that generated so much wealth and power for the institutional church. The economic implications alone are staggering. Consider the billions of dollars that have flowed through church coffers over the centuries, the vast landholdings acquired by religious institutions, the political influence wielded by religious authorities. All of this was built on the foundation that spiritual authority could only be legitimate if it came through approved male channels. Mary Magdalene's example threatened that entire system, but the Gnostic texts reveal something even more threatening to established religious power structures. They suggest that the conflict between Mary and Peter wasn't just about gender roles or apostolic succession. It was about two fundamentally different concepts of what divine authority actually means. In the Orthodox tradition that emerged victorious, authority flows downward from God through Christ, to the apostles, to the bishops, to the priests, to the people. It's hierarchical, institutional. mediated through official channels. In the Gnostic tradition, represented by Mary Magdalene, authority flows within each spark upward from the divine person, through direct spiritual experience to shared understanding among equals. It's democratic, experiential, available to anyone regardless of gender or social status. You don't need a priest to intercede with God because you can connect with the divine directly. You don't need official permission to share spiritual insights because wisdom belongs to everyone who achieves it. This is why the Gospel of Mary Magdalene focuses not on Jesus' death and resurrection, but on his teachings about the nature of reality and the path to enlightenment. In this text, salvation doesn't come through believing the right doctrines or receiving the correct sacraments. It comes through understanding the true nature of existence, through recognizing the divine element within yourself, through achieving gnosis, or direct knowledge of spiritual truth. Mary's role in this process isn't as an intermediary between humans and God, like a priest or bishop. Her role is as a guide who helps others discover their own capacity for divine knowledge. She doesn't claim exclusive authority over spiritual truth. Instead, she demonstrates how spiritual authority works in a truly democratic system. Belongs it to whoever achieves the highest level of understanding and wisdom, regardless of their gender, social status, or institutional position. The dialogue in the Gospel of Mary makes this crystal clear. When Peter challenges Mary's right to share Jesus' secret teachings, he's not just expressing personal jealousy. He's defending an entire worldview based on institutional authority and gender hierarchy. He cannot accept that spiritual wisdom might be distributed based on merit rather than official position, or that a woman might possess deeper spiritual insight than the men Jesus originally chose as his apostles. Levi's defense of Mary is equally revealing. He doesn't argue that Mary should be respected because Jesus loved her, or because she held some official position. Instead, he argues that her wisdom speaks for itself. Surely the Savior knows her very well. That is why he loved her more than us. In other words, Jesus recognized Mary's spiritual capacity and chose her as his primary successor based on her actual qualifications, not on gender-based assumptions about who deserves religious authority. This meritocratic approach to spiritual leadership appears throughout the Gnostic texts. In Pistis Sophia, Mary dominates the theological discussions, not because she's been given some official title, but because she consistently asks the most insightful questions and provides the most sophisticated interpretations. Her authority emerges naturally from her demonstrated wisdom, not from institutional appointment. The contrast with Orthodox Christianity couldn't be more stark. In the system that emerged victorious, spiritual authority is distributed based on gender, ordination, and institutional hierarchy. A recently ordained male priest has more official religious authority than a woman who has spent decades in prayer, study, and spiritual practice. A bishop appointed through political processes has more theological authority than a scholar who has devoted their life to understanding divine truth. The Gnostic texts suggest that early Christianity might have developed very differently. Instead of massive cathedrals built to demonstrate institutional power, we might have seen small communities focused on shared spiritual exploration. Instead of elaborate rituals designed to emphasize the separation between clergy and laity, we might have seen practices aimed at helping everyone achieve direct spiritual experience. Instead of theological debates settled by institutional authority, we might have seen ongoing conversations where wisdom emerged through collective discernment. But this alternative was systematically destroyed, and the evidence of its destruction reveals just how threatened the emerging Orthodox Church felt by Gnostic ideas. The violence used against Gnostic communities wasn't just about theological disagreement. It was about eliminating a competing model of how spiritual authority should work. The suppression wasn't limited to burning books and executing leaders. The Orthodox Church also engaged in what we would now recognize as historical revisionism on a massive scale. They didn't just hide the Gnostic texts. They rewrote the story of early Christianity to make it seem like their version had always been the only legitimate option. This is why the discovery of the Nag Hammadi Library was so revolutionary. It provided documentary evidence that early Christianity had been far more diverse than official church history suggested. It showed that the conflicts described in Orthodox sources as battles between truth and heresy were actually battles between competing visions of what Christianity should become. The Gospel of Mary Magdalene, in particular, reveals that the apostolic succession claimed by the Catholic Church, the idea that religious authority flows directly from Peter through an unbroken chain of male bishops, was contested from the very beginning. Mary's followers would have argued that true apostolic succession should flow through her, the disciple who best understood Jesus' teachings and was specifically chosen to carry them forward. Imagine how different Christian history would have been if Mary's version had won. Instead of the Crusades launched to defend institutional church authority, we might have seen movements focused on inner spiritual development. Instead of the Inquisition designed to enforce doctrinal uniformity, we might have seen communities celebrating diverse paths to divine understanding. Instead of witch trials targeting women who claimed spiritual authority outside official channels, we might have seen traditions that honored female spiritual leadership. The economic and political implications would have been equally dramatic. Without a centralized institutional hierarchy claiming exclusive control over salvation, there would have been no foundation for the enormous wealth and political power that religious institutions accumulated over the centuries. The Church couldn't have functioned as a parallel government throughout medieval Europe if people believed they could connect with God directly without priestly mediation. This is why the Mary Magdalene cover-up was so crucial to the development of institutional Christianity. It wasn't enough to simply exclude women from positions of authority. The Church had to discredit the entire model of spiritual leadership that Mary represented. They had to convince people that direct spiritual experience was dangerous, that religious authority required institutional validation, that ordinary believers couldn't be trusted with divine truth. The prostitute narrative served this purpose perfectly. By transforming Mary from a spiritual teacher into a repentant sinner, the Church created a cautionary tale about what happened to women who stepped outside their prescribed roles. Mary became an example, not of female spiritual authority, but of female moral failure redeemed through male forgiveness. Her story reinforced rather than challenged the patriarchal structure of organized religion. But the Forbidden Gospels preserve a different memory. They remember a Mary Magdalene who was Jesus' intellectual equal, his spiritual partner, his chosen successor. They remember a woman who understood divine mysteries that confused the male apostles, who provided comfort and guidance when they were paralyzed by fear, who had the courage to challenge their assumptions about gender and authority. Most importantly, they remember a version of Christianity where spiritual authority was earned through wisdom and merit rather than inherited through gender and institutional position. They preserve the memory of a path not taken, a Christianity that might have developed along radically different lines if Mary's vision had triumphed over Peter's. The question facing us today is whether it's too late to recover that vision. After 2,000 years of institutional Christianity, after centuries of conditioning that have taught us to associate religious authority with male hierarchy, can we still imagine alternatives? Can we envision forms of spirituality that honor both the Mary Magdalene of the Forbidden Gospels and the spiritual hunger that draws people to seek divine truth in the first place? The answer may depend on whether we're willing to do what the Gnostic Christians did, to prioritize direct spiritual experience over institutional authority, to value wisdom wherever it emerges regardless of the gender or status of its source, to believe that divine truth is too important to be controlled by any single organization or hierarchy. Because ultimately, the story of Mary Magdalene isn't just about one woman who lived 2,000 years ago. It's about the ongoing struggle between those who seek to control spiritual authority and those who believe it should be freely available to anyone who earnestly seeks it. It's about whether we'll continue to accept the limitations placed on human spiritual potential by institutions that benefit from those limitations, or whether we'll have the courage to explore the possibilities that were buried along with the forbidden Gospels in the Egyptian desert. The texts are no longer buried, the evidence is no longer hidden. The choice of what to do with this knowledge is ours. The evidence doesn't stop there. What we've uncovered so far is just the tip of an iceberg that goes much deeper than most people realize. Because when you start digging into the historical record, when you examine the archaeological evidence, when you trace the paper trail of how these texts survived and how they were suppressed, a pattern emerges that's so systematic, so deliberate, that it can only be described as one of history's most successful cover-ups. Let's talk about what happened to the communities that preserved Mary Magdalene's true teachings. The Gnostic Christians weren't just theological opponents of Orthodox Christianity. They were organized communities with their own churches, their own rituals, their own leadership structures. And in many of these communities, women served as priests, bishops, and teachers. They baptized converted marriages, performed, led worship services, and interpreted scripture with the same authority as their male counterparts. This wasn't some modern feminist reimagining of ancient Christianity. This was documented historical reality. The church father Epiphanius, writing in the 4th century, was scandalized by what he witnessed in Gnostic communities. He wrote with obvious disgust about women who dared to perform priestly functions, who claimed to receive divine revelations, who taught theology to mixed audiences of men and women. His horror at these practices tells us everything we need to know about how threatening they were to the emerging Orthodox establishment. But here's what makes this even more remarkable. These weren't isolated incidents or occasional exceptions to normal practice. Archaeological evidence from early Christian sites reveals that women's religious leadership was widespread and accepted in many communities. Inscriptions on tombstones describe women as presbyter and episcopa, female priests and bishops. Mosaics in ancient churches depict women performing what are clearly liturgical functions. Papyrus documents record women owning church property and directing religious communities. The Orthodox Church didn't just disagree with these practices. They systematically destroyed the evidence. Churches were rebuilt to eliminate feminine imagery. Inscriptions were defaced to remove references to female clergy. Documents were edited to downplay women's roles or eliminate them entirely. It was historical revisionism on an industrial scale. And at the center of this campaign was the deliberate destruction of Mary Magdalene's reputation. Because she wasn't just any woman claiming religious authority, she was the woman who could trace her authority directly back to Jesus himself. If people accepted that Jesus had chosen her as his primary successor, it would legitimize women's religious leadership in a way that no amount of theological argument could overcome. The prostitute narrative solved this problem perfectly. It didn't deny Mary's importance. That would have been impossible given her prominence in the canonical Gospels. Instead, it reframed her importance in a way that actually reinforced male religious authority. She became the grateful sinner, the redeemed woman whose salvation depended entirely on male forgiveness and guidance. Her closeness to Jesus was explained not by her spiritual merit, but by his gracious willingness to save even the most fallen women. This narrative was so effective that it survived for over a millennium without serious challenge. Even when Renaissance scholars began studying the original Greek and Latin texts of the Bible, even when they noticed that the Gospels never actually call Mary Magdalene a prostitute, the label stuck. The story had become too useful, too embedded in Christian consciousness, too important for maintaining the status quo. But the Gnostic texts preserve a memory that the Orthodox Church couldn't completely erase. They remember a Mary Magdalene who didn't need male validation because she had divine validation. A woman who didn't seek forgiveness for sexual sins because she had committed no such sins. A teacher whose authority came not from institutional appointment, but from demonstrated spiritual wisdom. The Gospel of Mary is particularly striking in this regard. When Mary shares the secret revelations that Jesus gave to her privately, she doesn't present them as personal opinions or tentative suggestions. She speaks with complete confidence and authority. She explains complex theological concepts with the assurance of someone who has truly understood their meaning. She demonstrates exactly the kind of spiritual leadership that the early Christian movement desperately needed. But notice what happens next. The male disciples don't question her teachings on theological grounds. They don't point out errors in her reasoning or inconsistencies in her interpretation. Instead, they attack her personally. Peter's objection isn't that Mary is wrong. It's that she's a woman. He can't refute her wisdom, so he tries to delegitimize her voice. This is the same pattern we see repeated throughout history whenever women claim spiritual authority. Their ideas aren't evaluated on their merits. Their qualifications aren't assessed fairly. Instead, they're dismissed using gender-based assumptions about who has the right to speak on religious matters. The Gospel of Thomas makes this dynamic even more explicit. When Peter demands that Mary be excluded from the group because females are not worthy of life's not-making, a theological argument, he's making a power grab. He's trying to eliminate competition by excluding an entire gender from consideration. And Jesus' response, that he will make Mary male so that she can enter the kingdom, isn't an endorsement of Peter's position. It's a rejection of the gender categories that Peter is trying to use to maintain his dominance. In Gnostic theology, transcending gender didn't mean becoming literally male. It meant moving beyond the limiting categories that society used to determine who could access divine truth. Mary didn't need to become male to be worthy of spiritual authority. She needed to transcend the social constructions that told her she was unworthy because she was female. This is why the Gnostic texts were so dangerous to the emerging Orthodox Church. They didn't just include women in religious life as subordinate participants. They presented a vision of Christianity where gender was irrelevant to spiritual capacity, where authority was based on wisdom rather than institutional position, where direct divine experience was more important than official doctrine. The economic implications of this vision were staggering. The Roman Catholic Church became one of the wealthiest institutions in human history by establishing a monopoly on salvation. They convinced people that spiritual authority could only flow through their ordained priests, that sacraments were only valid when performed by their licensed clergy, that access to divine truth required submission to their hierarchical structure. But if people believed that anyone, including women, could receive direct revelations from God, if they accepted that spiritual wisdom could emerge from any source regardless of gender or institutional affiliation, if they embraced the idea that every person contained a divine spark that could connect them directly to ultimate truth, then the entire economic foundation of institutional Christianity would collapse overnight. This is why the suppression of the Gnostic texts wasn't just about theology. It was about protecting a business model that generated enormous wealth and power for religious authorities. The church couldn't afford to let people believe that they could access God directly without paying for the privilege through official channels. The violence used against Gnostic communities reveals just how much was at stake. These weren't theological debates settled through scholarly discussion. They were life and death struggles for control over the spiritual lives and material resources of entire populations. When Emperor Theodosius effectively outlawed all forms of Christianity except the Orthodox version in the late 4th century, he wasn't just establishing religiosity, he was eliminating economic competition. The Gnostic Christians were literally hunted down and exterminated. Their books were burned in public squares. Their churches were destroyed or converted to Orthodox use. Their leaders were executed as heretics. Their communities were disbanded by force. It was genocide disguised as theological purification, and at the center of this campaign was the systematic destruction of any evidence that Jesus might have chosen a woman as his primary successor. Because Mary Magdalene represented more than just female religious leadership. She represented an entirely different model of how spiritual authority should work, one based on merit rather than gender, on wisdom rather than institutional position, on direct divine experience rather than mediated religious authority. The cover-up was so thorough that for over 1,500 years, almost no one knew that this alternative vision had ever existed. The Mary Magdalene who survived in Christian consciousness was the repentant prostitute who served as a cautionary tale about female sexuality and a symbol of grateful submission to male spiritual guidance. But the forbidden Gospels tell a different story. They remember a Mary Magdalene who challenged the apostles' assumptions, who possessed knowledge that they lacked, who demonstrated spiritual leadership that they couldn't match. They preserve the memory of a Christianity that might have developed along radically different lines if her vision had triumphed over Peter's. The implications of this suppressed history extend far beyond ancient religious politics. They reveal that the male-only priesthood, the exclusion of women from religious leadership, the assumption that men are naturally more qualified for spiritual authority. These aren't divinely ordained principles. They're human inventions designed to serve the interests of those who benefited from them. The Gnostic texts prove that there were early Christian communities where women served as priests and bishops, where gender was considered irrelevant to spiritual capacity, where religious authority was distributed based on demonstrated wisdom rather than institutional appointment. This wasn't some radical departure from Jesus' teachings. According to these texts, it was the direct continuation of the ministry that Jesus had entrusted to Mary Magdalene. Think about what this means for contemporary Christianity. Every denomination that excludes women from ordination, every church that teaches that men are naturally better suited for religious leadership, every theology that assumes spiritual authority must flow through male hierarchies. They're all built on the foundation of the lie that destroyed Mary Magdalene's reputation. The canonical Gospels themselves provide evidence that contradicts this foundation. They show Mary Magdalene as Jesus' most faithful follower, the first witness to the resurrection, the one who brought news of the risen Christ to the cowering male disciples. If the resurrection is the central miracle of Christianity, then the woman who first witnessed and proclaimed it should be honored as the most important apostle, not dismissed as a reformed prostitute. But the Orthodox Church couldn't allow Mary to be seen as the primary apostle because that would undermine their entire claim to exclusive religious authority. If Jesus had chosen a woman as his successor, then women throughout history should have been eligible for the highest positions in Christian churches. If spiritual authority could be distributed based on divine calling rather than gender, then the male monopoly on religious leadership had no biblical foundation. The prostitute narrative solved this problem by transforming Mary from a threat into a symbol. Instead of representing female spiritual authority, she came to represent female moral failure redeemed through male guidance. Instead of challenging the assumption that men were naturally better suited for religious leadership, her story reinforced it by suggesting that women's primary spiritual need was forgiveness for sexual sins. This transformation wasn't accidental. It was a calculated strategy designed to neutralize the most dangerous threat to male religious authority that had ever existed. And it worked so well that even today, most Christians are completely unaware that it ever happened. The rediscovery of the Gnostic texts has begun to change this. Scholars now recognize that early Christianity was far more diverse than official church history suggested. They acknowledge that women played much more prominent roles in early Christian communities than later traditions admitted. They understand that the version of Christianity that became dominant was just one option among many, not the inevitable result of divine guidance. But this scholarly knowledge has been slow to filter down to popular consciousness. Most church members still have no idea that the Gnostic Gospels exist, much less what they reveal about Mary Magdalene's true role in early Christianity. The institutions that benefit from the current system have little incentive to publicize information that challenges their authority. This is why conversations like this one are so important. The truth about Mary Magdalene isn't just ancient history. It's a key that unlocks questions about religious authority, gender equality, and spiritual freedom that are just as relevant today as they were 2,000 years ago. When we understand that the exclusion of women from religious leadership was a human choice rather than a divine commandment, when we recognize that spiritual authority was once distributed based on wisdom rather than gender, when we realize that direct divine experience was once considered more important than institutional mediation, we begin to see possibilities that have been hidden for centuries. The Mary Magdalene of the Forbidden Gospels represents a path not taken, a Christianity that might have developed along radically different lines. She embodies values that challenge not just religious institutions, but the entire structure of patriarchal authority that those institutions helped to establish and maintain. Her story reminds us that history is written by the winners, that the version of events we inherit is often shaped more by power than by truth, and that the most dangerous ideas are often the ones that get buried most deeply. But it also reminds us that truth has a way of surfacing, no matter how many centuries pass, no matter how many layers of lies are piled on top of it. The Forbidden Gospels survived 1,500 years buried in the Egyptian desert. They emerged at exactly the moment when humanity was ready to hear their message again. The question now is whether we have the courage to listen to what they're telling us, not just about Mary Magdalene, but about the nature of spiritual authority, the possibilities for religious community, and the paths toward divine truth that remain open to us today. Because ultimately, this isn't just about rehabilitating one woman's reputation or correcting historical inaccuracies. It's about reclaiming possibilities that were stolen from us, recovering wisdom that was deliberately hidden, and discovering alternatives to systems of authority that have dominated human consciousness for 2 millennia. The revolution that Mary Magdalene represented didn't die when her reputation was destroyed. It went underground, preserved in texts that no one was supposed to read, waiting for a time when people would be ready to hear its message again. That time may have finally come. The only question is what we'll do with the knowledge that these forbidden gospels have given us. The war for control of Christianity wasn't won in boardrooms or through theological debates. It was won through one of the most sophisticated propaganda campaigns in human history. And the first casualty of that war was truth itself. What I'm about to show you reveals the breathtaking scope of this deception. We're not just talking about editing a few uncomfortable passages or venient facts. We're talking about playing in con down the complete fabric eventsation of historical, the systematic destruction of entire libraries, and the murder of thousands of people whose only crime was preserving the wrong version of Christianity. The evidence for this cover-up is hidden in plain sight, scattered across archaeological and forgotten archives, in code sites, buried in the very art and architecture of medieval churches. Once you know what to look for, the signs are everywhere. The question isn't whether this suppression happened. The question is how they managed to keep it hidden for so long. Let's start with something that should disturb every Christian who has ever lived. The New Testament that sits on your bookshelf right now, the collection of texts that billions of people consider the Word of God, was assembled emperored by a Roman who wasn't even baptized until he was on his deathbed. Constantine I called the Council of Nicaea in 325 CE, not because he had experienced some profound spiritual awakening, but because religious conflict was destabilizing his empire. He needed one version of Christianity that everyone could agree on, and he was willing to use whatever force was necessary to achieve it. The bishops who attended that council didn't arrive through divine calling or spiritual merit. They were appointed by political authorities, men who understood that their careers depended on pleasing the emperor. When they sat down to decide which books would be included in the official Bible and which would be banned forever, they weren't guided by the Holy Spirit. They were guided by imperial policy. Think about what this means. The Christianity that conquered the world, the version that shaped Western civilization for 2 organic millennia, wasn't the result of spiritual development or divine revelation. It was the product of political calculation designed to serve the needs of the Roman state. Every book that challenged imperial authority, every text organization of religious that suggest forms alternative, every gospel that promoted dangerous ideas about spiritual equality, was systematically eliminated. The Gnostic Christians understood what was happening. They watched their leaders being arrested, their books being burned, their communities being disbanded by force. They knew that their version of Christianity was being erased from history. That's why they buried the Nag Hammadi Library. They weren't just hiding books, they were preserving the evidence of one of history's greatest crimes. Because what was lost wasn't just Mary Magdalene's reputation or women's religious authority. What was lost was an entire understanding of what Christianity could have been. The Gnostic texts' religion reveal a focus on inner transformation rather than external obedience, on direct spiritual experience rather than institutional mediation, on the liberation of human consciousness rather than the control of human behavior. In Of Mary, Jesus the Gospel doesn't establish a church or hierarchy, ordain male priests to control access to divine truth. Instead, he teaches techniques for achieving enlightenment, methods for transcending the limitations of ordinary practices consciousness, for discovering the divine spark that exists within every human being. This isn't Christianity as we know it today. This is Christianity as a revolutionary spiritual technology designed to liberate humanity from every form of oppression, including religious oppression. The implications were staggering. If people believed they could connect with God directly, why would they need priests? If they understood that divine wisdom could emerge from anyone regardless of gender or social status, why would they submit to religious authorities? If they realized that spiritual truth was freely available to anyone who earnestly sought it, why would they pay for salvation through official church channels? The economic threat alone was enough to warrant extermination. But the political threat was even greater. The Gnostic Christians didn't just reject the authority of bishops and priests. They rejected the entire concept of religious hierarchy. They believed that spiritual authority should be earned through wisdom and merit, not inherited through gender and institutional position. They practiced a form of democracy that wouldn't be seen again in Western society for over 1,000 years. This is why the suppression was so brutal and so complete. The Orthodox Church wasn't just eliminating theological competitors. They were crushing a social revolution that threatened every existing power structure. The Gnostic vision of Christianity would have made kings unnecessary, emperors obsolete, and religious institutions irrelevant. The scale of the destruction is almost impossible to comprehend. Entire libraries were burned. Thousands of manuscripts were destroyed. Scholars estimate that we've lost over 90% of all Gnostic literature. What survived at Nag Hammadi represents just a tiny fraction of what once existed. We're looking at the remnants of a civilization that was deliberately obliterated. But here's what makes this even more chilling. The Orthodox Church didn't just destroy the Gnostic texts. They replaced them with forgeries. Scholars have identified dozens of documents that were fabricated to support Orthodox positions, texts that were backdated and attributed to apostolic authors to give them false authority. The Church literally rewrote history to make their version appear more legitimate. The forged letters attributed to Paul are particularly revealing. These texts, which appear in the New Testament as authentic apostolic writings, contain some of the most misogynistic passages in Christian scripture. Verses commanding women to remain silent in churches, to submit to male authority, to cover their heads as signs of subservience, These weren't written by the Apostle Paul. They were created by later church officials who needed biblical justification for excluding women from religious leadership. The real Paul, the Paul who wrote the authentic letters that can be verified through textual analysis, worked closely with female evangelists and acknowledged women as his equals in ministry. He praised Junia as outstanding among the apostles, commended Phoebe as a deacon of the church, and described Priscilla as his fellow worker in Christ Jesus. The Paul who emerges from authentic historical sources looks nothing like the misogynist portrayed in the forged letters. But the forgeries served their purpose. They provided biblical cover for policies that were actually rooted in Roman imperial law and Greek philosophical prejudices against women. They made it seem like the exclusion of women from religious authority was divinely commanded rather than politically motivated. The same pattern appears throughout Orthodox Christian literature. Texts were edited to remove references to female religious leaders. Stories were rewritten to diminish women's roles. Entire gospels were suppressed because they presented women as spiritual authorities. The systematic nature of this revisionism reveals that it wasn't accidental. It was a coordinated campaign designed to erase women from Christian history. Archaeological evidence confirms what the textual evidence suggests. Excavations at early Christian sites have uncovered numerous inscriptions referring to female priests, bishops, and church leaders. But many of these inscriptions were later defaced or destroyed. Churches were rebuilt to eliminate feminine imagery. Mosaics depicting women in positions of authority were covered over or replaced, with scenes showing women in subordinate roles. Even the art that survived tells a story of deliberate suppression. Early Christian frescoes often show Mary Magdalene teaching, blessing, and leading worship services. But later, medieval art consistently depicts her as a penitent sinner, weeping at Jesus' feet, or retreating to a cave to do penance for her supposed sins. The transformation is so complete that by the Renaissance, no one remembered that Mary Magdalene had ever been portrayed as anything other than a reformed prostitute. The economic records are equally revealing. Church documents from the medieval period show enormous sums being spent on what they euphemistically called correction of texts. These weren't scholarly editing projects. They were systematic campaigns to alter historical records, to remove inconvenient facts, to create new narratives that supported existing power structures. Monasteries employed armies of scribes whose sole job was to copy manuscripts while removing problematic passages. Libraries were purged of books that contained dangerous ideas. Even private collections were subject to inspection and confiscation. The church created what amounted to a medieval thought police, monitoring the flow of information to ensure that only approved versions of Christian history survived. The human cost of this suppression is incalculable. We know from surviving records that thousands of Gnostic Christians were executed as heretics. Their crime wasn't violence or immorality. Their crime was preserving texts that challenged orthodox authority, maintaining traditions that honored female spiritual leadership, practicing forms of Christianity that emphasize direct divine experience over institutional mediation. The Cathars in southern France were completely exterminated in the 13th century because they preserved Gnostic teachings about the equality of women and men in spiritual matters. The Waldensians were hunted across Europe for centuries because they allowed women to preach and teach. The Begins were systematically disbanded because they created communities of religious women who lived independently of male supervision. Each of these groups traced their traditions back to the earliest days of Christianity. Each claimed to preserve teachings that had been passed down from the apostolic era. Each was destroyed not because their beliefs were unchristian, but because their beliefs threatened the male monopoly on religious authority that the Orthodox Church had worked so hard to establish. The pattern is consistent across centuries and continents. Any Christian community that honored women as spiritual equals, that preserved texts suggesting female apostolic authority, that maintained traditions tracing back to Mary Magdalene's teachings, was branded heretical and eliminated. The suppression wasn't theological. it was political. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of this cover-up is how successfully it has been maintained into the modern era. Even today, most Christians have no idea that alternative versions of their religion ever existed. They've been taught that the Christianity they inherited is the only Christianity that ever mattered, that any deviation from orthodox teaching is automatically suspect, that questioning established religious authority is tantamount to abandoning faith itself. This ignorance isn't accidental. It's the product of centuries of careful indoctrination designed to prevent exactly the kind of questions we're asking right now. Church authorities understand instinctively that knowledge is dangerous to their power. The more people know about Christian history, the more they'll question why things developed the way they did. That's why the discovery of the Nag Hammadi Library was initially suppressed by religious institutions. That's why the Gospel of Mary Magdalene remained untranslated for decades after its discovery. That's why most seminaries still don't require courses on Gnostic Christianity, even though these texts are crucial for understanding the development of Christian doctrine. The institutional resistance to this knowledge reveals that the cover-up isn't just historical, it's ongoing. Every denomination that continues to exclude women from ordination, every church that teaches male spiritual superiority, every theology that assumes religious authority must flow through patriarchal channels is actively participating in the suppression of Mary Magdalene's true legacy. But the evidence is finally becoming impossible to ignore. Archaeological discoveries continue to reveal the prominence of women in early Christian communities. Textual analysis keeps uncovering the systematic nature of the historical revisionism that created Orthodox Christianity. Scholarly research demonstrates again and again that the version of Christianity that survived was just one option among many, not the inevitable result of divine guidance. The question is no longer whether this suppression happened. The question is what we're going to do about it. Are we going to continue accepting the limitations that were imposed on human spiritual potential by people who benefited from those limitations? Are we going to keep pretending that male religious authority is divinely ordained when the evidence clearly shows it was politically constructed? Or are we going to have the courage to explore the possibilities that were buried along with the forbidden Gospels? Are we going to investigate the forms of Christianity that honored women as spiritual equals? Are we going to consider what religion might look like if it were based on wisdom and merit, rather than gender and institutional position? The Mary Magdalene of the forbidden Gospels represents more than just an alternative interpretation of Christian history. She represents an alternative vision of what human spiritual potential could be. She embodies possibilities that were stolen from us, wisdom that was deliberately hidden, paths toward divine truth that remain open if we're brave enough to walk them. The revolution she started didn't end when her reputation was destroyed. It went underground, preserved in texts that survived against all odds, waiting for a time when people would be ready to hear its message again. The forbidden Gospels didn't stay buried by accident. They emerged at exactly the moment when humanity needed to rediscover what had been lost. That moment is now. The evidence is available. The texts have been translated. The historical record has been recovered. The only question is whether we have the wisdom to learn from it and the courage to act on what we've learned. Because this isn't just about ancient history or theological debates. This is about the future of human consciousness, the possibilities for spiritual community, and the kinds of authority we're willing to accept in our own lives. The Mary Magdalene cover-up reveals that the most dangerous truth in human history isn't about politics or economics. It's about the unlimited potential that exists within every human being to connect directly with divine truth, regardless of their gender, social status, or institutional affiliation. That potential was never actually destroyed. It was just hidden, waiting to be rediscovered by people who were ready to see beyond the lies that have shaped our understanding of spirituality for 2,000 years. The forbidden Gospels are our roadmap back to that potential. The question is whether we're ready to follow where they lead. So where does that leave us? standing at the edge of one of the most profound revelations in human history. For 14 centuries, we've been living with the consequences of the greatest cover-up ever orchestrated. The woman who should have been remembered as Christianity's first teacher, its most enlightened apostle, its chosen successor, was systematically erased and replaced with a lie so devastating that it shaped the spiritual lives of billions. The Mary Magdalene revealed in the Forbidden Gospels wasn't just Jesus' equal. She was his intellectual superior in many ways, demonstrating a depth of spiritual understanding that left the male disciples confused and threatened. She was the teacher who could explain what they couldn't grasp, the leader who provided strength when they cowered in fear, the visionary who carried forward the most revolutionary spiritual movement in human history. But that version of Christianity died in the 4th century, murdered by men who understood that spiritual democracy was incompatible with institutional power. What survived wasn't the religion of Mary Magdalene, with its emphasis on direct divine experience and gender equality. What survived was the religion of Peter, with its rigid hierarchies and male-only authority structures. Every church that excludes women from leadership today is built on the foundation of that ancient lie. Every denomination that teaches male spiritual superiority is perpetuating the fraud that began with Pope Gregory's fabrication in 591 CE. Every believer who accepts that religious authority must flow through patriarchal channels is unknowingly participating in the suppression of the most important spiritual teacher in Christian history. The Forbidden Gospels didn't survive 1500 years buried in the Egyptian desert by accident. They emerged at precisely the moment when humanity was ready to reclaim what had been stolen. The question now isn't whether we have the evidence. We do. The question is whether we have the courage to act on it. Because this isn't just about correcting historical injustices or rehabilitating one woman's reputation. This is about recovering possibilities that were taken from all of us. The Mary Magdalene of the Gnostic texts represents a path towards spiritual truth that doesn't require institutional permission, doesn't depend on gender hierarchies, and doesn't need anyone's authorization except the divine spark that exists within every human being. That revolution is still waiting to be born. The only question is whether you're ready to be part of it.